Have you ever answered a simple question with 3 full minutes of explanation nobody actually asked for? You justified the decision. You listed your reasons. You anticipated objections that were never raised and defended yourself against a criticism that had not even happened yet. By the time you finished, the room felt different, and not in the way you hoped. The explanation, meant to earn respect, had quietly spent it instead. Most people are taught that a good explanation builds trust. So you explain, you clarify, you justify again and again, hoping that enough words will finally produce the understanding or the approval you are reaching for. And yet, the more you explain, the smaller you seem to become in the room, while the people who say the least often seem to command the most attention without even trying. You were not wrong to want to be understood. You were simply using the wrong currency. Words, when spent without limit, lose their value. Silence, held deliberately, does not. Here is the idea this entire audiobook is built around. Explaining yourself is a request for permission. Silence is a statement of position. Every time an explanation is offered that nobody required, a small, invisible signal is sent, that approval is being sought, that the position taken needs defending, that comfort depends on someone else agreeing with it. Silence sends the opposite signal, entirely without a single argument. Over the course of this audiobook, you will learn why over-explaining quietly signals weakness rather than honesty, why the person who answers a provocation with nothing at all is rarely seen as weak, why boundaries stated once without apology carry more weight than boundaries defended for an hour, and why commanding a room has far less to do with talking and far more to do with the discipline of knowing exactly when not to. You do not need to become cold, distant, or unkind. You do not need to stop caring what people think entirely. You simply need to stop paying for respect with words it was never going to buy. Think of every time an explanation was offered and the room somehow felt less convinced afterward than before it began. That feeling was never a sign of failing to explain clearly enough. It was a sign that the explanation itself was the thing quietly working against the outcome it was trying to produce. This audiobook is about learning to notice that moment and choosing something different instead. And it begins now. Introduction. The currency nobody taught you to spend wisely. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly explaining yourself to a boss, a partner, a family member, a stranger online, justifying a decision that was never actually up for debate in the first place. It rarely feels like weakness while it is happening. It feels like being reasonable, being considerate, being willing to hear the other side. And yet afterward, there is often a quiet, nagging feeling that something was given away in that exchange that did not need to be given at all. Words are not free, even though they cost nothing to produce. Every explanation offered without being required spends a small amount of authority. The same way handing over a wallet without being asked spends money nobody demanded in the first place. This is not a call to become secretive or withholding as a personality. It is an invitation to notice how much authority quietly leaks out of ordinary conversations, simply because so few people were ever taught that silence is also a choice, and often the stronger one. The Persian mystic Rumi is often translated as saying, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." Beneath the poetry, there is a practical truth. Silence carries a kind of completeness that language constantly struggles to reach, because every explanation, no matter how careful, opens a new door for debate, doubt, or negotiation that did not previously exist. A position stated once and then left alone is far harder to argue with than a position defended at length, precisely because the defense itself implies there is still something worth arguing about. This audiobook is not about becoming unreachable or emotionally unavailable. It is about recognizing a very specific, very common habit, the reflex to justify a decision, a boundary, or a feeling the moment it meets even the smallest resistance, and learning to interrupt that reflex deliberately. Most people over-explain not because they enjoy it, but because silence in the moment it is needed most feels unbearably uncomfortable, and words rush in simply to fill a gap that never actually needed filling. Across the chapters ahead, you will learn to recognize the 5 habits that quietly leak authority through unnecessary words, why silence functions as one of the most effective responses to provocation that exists, how to hold a boundary without defending it, and how to become the kind of presence that commands a room without needing to fill it with noise. None of this asks you to speak less out of fear or coldness. It asks you to speak only when speaking actually adds something, and to trust that the space left afterward is not empty. It is where respect quietly gathers instead. None of this requires a naturally quiet temperament or a reserved personality to begin with. Some of the people who benefit most from these ideas are naturally warm, talkative, and generous with explanation, and that warmth does not need to disappear for any of this to work. What changes is not how much genuine warmth gets offered, but how much of that warmth gets diluted by unnecessary justification, offered reflexively in moments that never actually called for it. Chapter 1. The myth that explaining yourself earns respect. From an early age, most people are taught a specific lesson. If a decision or a feeling can be justified clearly enough, disagreement will eventually dissolve into understanding. This lesson feels reasonable, and it is occasionally true. It is also the source of an exhausting, deeply ingrained habit that quietly undermines authority in countless ordinary situations. The myth works like this: a boundary is stated, a request is declined, a decision is made, and immediately an explanation follows. Not because the explanation was required, but because silence in that specific moment feels like it might be read as rudeness, coldness, or arrogance. So the explanation arrives, reasonable, detailed, sometimes even apologetic in tone, and it accomplishes something almost nobody intends. It reopens a decision that was actually already closed, inviting exactly the negotiation the explanation was meant to prevent. Consider the difference between two responses to the exact same request for an unreasonable favor. The first response explains at length, citing a busy schedule, prior commitments, and genuine regret at having to decline. The second response simply says, "That does not work for me this time." The first response, however polite and reasonable, invites a counteroffer because it has essentially handed over a list of specific objections that could each be individually addressed or negotiated around. The second response leaves nothing to negotiate with because nothing was offered as negotiable in the first place. This does not mean explanations are always wrong. A genuine two-way conversation between equals, where both sides are actually curious about each other's reasoning, is a different situation entirely from a decision being defended reflexively out of discomfort. The distinction that matters is intention. Is the explanation being offered because it serves a real mutual purpose, or because silence in that specific instant simply felt too uncomfortable to sit inside? Respect is rarely earned through the sheer volume of justification offered. It is earned through consistency between what is said and what is done, and through the quiet confidence of someone who does not feel the need to prove every decision correct the moment it is questioned. The myth that more explaining equals more respect has it backwards. Past a certain point, every additional word spent defending a position simply advertises that the position feels, even slightly, difficult to defend. Consider a manager who declines a request for a schedule change. One version of this manager explains at length, citing policy, precedent, staffing concerns, and a personal note of regret about having to say no. Another version simply says, "That is not something I can do this time." The first manager, despite being entirely reasonable, often finds the conversation continuing, as each cited reason becomes something the other person can individually push back against. The second manager, having offered nothing to argue with, typically finds the conversation ending cleanly, precisely because there was no list of objections handed over to negotiate against in the first place. This same pattern shows up constantly in family settings, where declining an invitation or a request often triggers a long list of reasons meant to soften the no. Each additional reason offered, however sincere, quietly invites a specific counter-argument, an offer to reschedule around the stated conflict, a suggestion that the concern raised is not actually as significant as it sounds. A single, warm, complete decline, without the accompanying list of justifications, tends to be accepted far more smoothly, precisely because it leaves nothing behind for anyone to negotiate against. This same principle extends into how apologies function within ordinary conversation. An apology followed immediately by 3 sentences explaining exactly why the mistake happened often reads as an attempt to be excused rather than an acknowledgement of the mistake itself. A brief, sincere apology, offered without an extended defense of the circumstances surrounding it, tends to be accepted more readily and closes the matter more completely, precisely because it does not invite a debate over whether the surrounding circumstances actually excuse what happened. There is a version of this worth naming specifically within romantic relationships, the difference between explaining a mistake once sincerely and continuing to relitigate the same mistake across several subsequent conversations out of lingering guilt. The first builds trust because it demonstrates accountability without turning the moment into an extended negotiation over blame. The second often erodes trust instead because it signals that the matter has not genuinely been resolved internally, regardless of how many times forgiveness has already been offered and accepted. Chapter 2. The 5 silent habits that are quietly costing you respect. Certain patterns of speech leak authority so consistently and so invisibly that most people never notice them happening in real time. Removing them does not require becoming a different personality. It requires recognizing 5 specific habits clearly enough to catch them before they finish leaving your mouth. The first habit is the preemptive apology, saying sorry before a sentence has even fully begun. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry if this is a bad time. Sorry, this might be a stupid question. Each of these phrases quietly announces, before a single substantive word has been spoken, that whatever follows is somehow less deserving of space in the conversation than it actually is. The second habit is the trailing qualifier, adding phrases like, "But I could be wrong," or "It is just my opinion," immediately after stating something that did not need softening at all. Occasionally, genuine uncertainty deserves to be acknowledged honestly. Far more often, this habit simply discounts a perfectly reasonable statement before anyone else has even had the chance to disagree with it. The third habit is over-justifying a simple no. A single clear decline requires no supporting evidence. Attaching 3 separate reasons to a straightforward no signals, unintentionally, that the no itself might not be considered sufficient on its own, inviting exactly the negotiation a clean decline was meant to close. The fourth habit is the rising intonation at the end of a statement, turning a firm sentence into something that sounds like a question, even when no question was intended. This vocal habit alone can quietly undercut an otherwise confident, well-reasoned statement, making it sound like a request for approval rather than a settled conclusion. The fifth habit is filling silence purely because it feels uncomfortable. Continuing to talk after a point has already been fully made simply because a pause in the conversation felt awkward to sit inside. This habit often produces the most damage of all 5 because it frequently undoes a strong point by immediately following it with something weaker, less confident, or entirely unnecessary. None of these 5 habits are moral failings. They are simply learned reflexes, usually built from genuine kindness or a desire to avoid conflict, that quietly cost more authority than most people realize until the pattern is named directly and noticed in real time. These 5 habits tend to cluster together, and they usually share a common root: a learned belief that taking up space in a conversation needs to be earned through visible humility or constant reassurance offered to everyone else in the room. Noticing one habit often makes the other 4 considerably easier to spot as well, since they typically travel together, all pointing back toward the same underlying discomfort with simply saying something once, clearly, and letting it stand without immediate reinforcement. A useful practice for catching these habits involves a brief review after any conversation that felt slightly draining afterward, specifically checking whether an apology, qualifier, extra justification, upward inflection, or unnecessary continuation appeared where a clean, complete statement would have done the same job with less. This review is not about self-criticism. It is about building the specific kind of awareness that eventually allows these 5 habits to be caught mid-sentence, in real time, rather than only noticed afterward, once the conversation has already concluded. It is worth adding a final note of reassurance directly here. Noticing these 5 habits in personal speech for the first time can feel discouraging. as though a lifetime of conversations suddenly needs to be re-examined and regretted. That reaction, while understandable, misses the actual point of this chapter. These habits are common precisely because they were reasonable responses to real social pressures encountered over many years. The goal was never to judge the past use of these habits harshly. It was simply to make the pattern visible enough that a different choice becomes genuinely available going forward. Before we move into the next chapter, if recognizing these habits in your own speech feels useful already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because every audiobook in this series builds toward the same underlying skill, presence that commands respect, without needing to chase it through words. Now let's continue, because what comes next explains exactly why silence itself, used well, is one of the strongest responses available in almost any difficult conversation. Chapter 3. Why over-explaining signals? Weakness, not honesty. There is a specific, uncomfortable truth worth sitting with directly. The amount of explanation offered for a decision is often inversely related to how secure that decision actually feels internally. A person who is completely certain of a boundary rarely needs more than a single sentence to state it. A person who feels some private doubt about that same boundary often reaches, almost automatically, for additional justification, as if enough supporting reasons might quiet an uncertainty that words alone were never actually going to resolve. This creates a strange and important effect in how explanations are perceived by other people. A brief, calm statement of a decision tends to read as confidence. A long, detailed justification of that exact same decision tends to read as insecurity, even when the underlying reasoning in both cases is identical. The listener is not evaluating the content of the explanation nearly as closely as they are evaluating the amount of it, and a large amount, however well-intentioned, almost always signals that something underneath still feels shaky. This does not mean honesty requires brevity in every single circumstance. Genuine complexity sometimes deserves genuine explanation, and collapsing an honestly complicated situation into a single clipped sentence can create its own kind of dishonesty, oversimplifying something that truly was not simple. The skill being described here is not silence for its own sake. It is matching the length of an explanation to what the situation actually requires, rather than to how uncomfortable the silence immediately after a decision happens to feel. A useful internal check exists for telling the difference. Before adding another sentence of justification, it helps to ask honestly, is this additional detail actually necessary for the other person to understand the decision? Or is it being added because the silence following the decision currently feels uncomfortable to sit inside? The first reason justifies continuing to speak. The second reason is a signal that the strongest, most respected version of this exact statement has probably already been made several sentences ago. There is a particular workplace scenario worth examining here, being asked to justify a completed piece of work in detail after it has already been reviewed and approved. The instinct is often to walk back through every decision made, defending each one individually, as though the entire project was still under review. A more composed response simply confirms the key reasoning briefly and stops, trusting that the work has already demonstrated its own value, rather than continuing to argue for a conclusion that has, in most practical senses, already been reached. It also helps to notice that the urge to keep explaining often intensifies specifically in front of an audience when other people are present to witness whether a position holds up under questioning. The presence of onlookers raises the perceived stakes of appearing to lose an exchange, which makes the discipline of stopping after a single clear statement considerably harder in public settings than in private ones. Recognizing this added social pressure for what it is, rather than mistaking it for a genuine need to keep explaining, makes it noticeably easier to stop at the right moment, even while being watched. There is a related pattern worth naming here, the habit of restating an already accepted point simply because a small amount of silence followed it. Silence after a point has landed is not automatically a sign that the point failed. It is often simply the natural pause of someone absorbing what was just said. Interpreting that pause as a signal to keep explaining frequently interrupts exactly the moment the original point would have otherwise been given room to settle and take hold. Chapter 4. The space between question and answer. There is a specific window, the brief pause between a question being asked and an answer being given, that carries far more weight than most people realize. Rushing to fill that space the instant a question lands is one of the most common and most costly habits, standing between ordinary conversation and genuinely commanding presence. An immediate answer, however correct, often reads as reactive, an automatic response produced without real consideration. A slightly delayed answer, even by a second or two, reads as considered, as though the question was actually taken seriously enough to deserve a moment of real thought before a response was offered. This difference in perception exists regardless of whether the extra second actually changed the content of the answer at all. This pause matters most in exactly the moments it feels hardest to allow: difficult questions, unexpected criticism, or a request delivered with pressure attached to it. The instinct in these moments is to fill the silence immediately, as if any gap in the conversation might be read as weakness or hesitation. In practice, the opposite tends to be true. A brief, deliberate pause before responding to pressure is one of the clearest, most visible signals of genuine composure that exists in ordinary conversation. Confucius is widely credited with observing that silence is a true friend who never betrays. Applied here, the pause before an answer is not empty, hesitant space. It is where genuine thought actually happens, rather than simply where nervous energy gets discharged as quickly as possible. Learning to tolerate that brief discomfort, rather than rushing to escape it with the very first word that comes to mind, is one of the simplest and most immediately noticeable shifts available in this entire audiobook. This pause carries a secondary benefit worth noting directly. It frequently improves the actual quality of the answer given, not just the perception of it. Words spoken the instant a question lands often draw on the very first association that surfaces, which is not always the most accurate or considered response available. A brief pause allows a slightly deeper layer of thought to surface before speech begins, which means the improved perception this habit produces is, more often than not, backed by an improved answer underneath it as well. This pause is particularly powerful in situations involving a genuine power difference, an interview, a negotiation, a difficult conversation with someone in a position of authority. In these specific settings, the instinct to fill silence immediately tends to be strongest, precisely because the stakes feel highest. And yet, this is exactly where a composed pause tends to carry the most visible weight, since it signals a kind of steadiness that pressure alone was not able to disrupt. Chapter 5. Boundaries without apology. A boundary loses much of its actual strength the moment it becomes wrapped in apology. "I am so sorry, but I cannot do this," sounds gentle and considerate on the surface, and it quietly undermines the boundary itself by suggesting that stating it required forgiveness in the first place. A boundary that requires no apology to state is a genuinely different kind of statement than one that constantly asks to be excused for existing. This distinction matters because boundaries, unlike requests, do not actually require agreement from the other person in order to be valid. A request can reasonably be negotiated, refused, or countered. A boundary, properly understood, describes a limit that exists regardless of whether the other person agrees with it or not. Treating a boundary as though it needs the other person's approval to be legitimate quietly transforms it back into a request, one that can now be pushed against, exactly as any other request could be. Stating a boundary without apology does not require harshness. A simple, calm, complete sentence, "I am not available for that," or "that does not work for me," delivered without an accompanying apology or extended justification, tends to land with considerably more authority than the same boundary wrapped in several additional sentences of regret. The words themselves barely change. The absence of apology changes almost everything about how those words are actually received. There is a specific discomfort worth naming directly here: the fear that a boundary stated plainly, without softening, will be perceived as cold or unkind. In practice, boundaries stated clearly and calmly are far more often respected than boundaries stated apologetically and at length, precisely because clarity itself reads as a kind of respect, both for the boundary and for the other person's ability to hear a direct answer without requiring it to be cushioned first. There is a common fear worth addressing directly, that a plainly stated boundary will damage a relationship that an apologetic one would have protected. In practice, most relationships worth preserving are strengthened, not weakened, by clear boundaries, because clarity removes the ongoing uncertainty of never quite knowing where an actual limit sits. Relationships that genuinely cannot tolerate a calmly stated boundary were, in most cases, already relying on the other person's constant self-minimizing to remain comfortable, which is a far more fragile foundation than any boundary could ever threaten. There is also a physical dimension worth naming, the tendency to soften a stated boundary with an apologetic tone of voice or posture, even when the actual words chosen were appropriately direct. A boundary undercut by an apologetic delivery communicates a mixed signal, one that often gets read by the listener as an invitation to push back, regardless of how clearly the sentence itself was constructed. Matching a calm, steady delivery to a clearly stated boundary closes this gap, ensuring the tone and the words are actually saying the same thing. There is a particular version of this worth naming in professional settings: declining additional work or an unreasonable deadline. A boundary here stated with an anxious tone and an overly long list of competing obligations often gets treated as an opening for negotiation. The same boundary, stated calmly and briefly, tends to be respected as a genuine limit rather than a starting offer, precisely because calm delivery signals a settled decision rather than a position still being worked out under pressure. There is a broader pattern worth naming here about boundaries and identity. Each time a boundary is stated clearly and held without apology, it becomes slightly easier to state the next one the same way. Each time a boundary is softened into an apologetic request instead, the next boundary tends to require the same softening to feel safe enough to state at all. Boundaries, in this sense, function less like isolated decisions and more like a compounding habit, one that grows either stronger or weaker with every single instance, depending on which version gets practiced. Chapter 6. The discipline of the unanswered question. Not every question deserves an answer, and one of the more advanced disciplines within the power of silence is learning to recognize which questions those actually are. Certain questions are asked not out of genuine curiosity, but specifically to provoke a reaction, to draw out a defensive explanation, or to shift the burden of proof onto someone who owes no explanation at all in that particular moment. A question delivered with genuine curiosity invites a genuine answer. A question delivered as a trap. Why would you even think that is a good idea? Or, do you really believe that will work? Is often designed less to gather information and more to produce a visible reaction, defensiveness, self-doubt, or an extended justification that can then be picked apart, piece by piece. Answering these questions as though they were asked in good faith frequently plays directly into the exact dynamic the question was designed to create. The discipline here is recognizing that silence, or a brief, neutral acknowledgement without a full defense, is itself a complete and legitimate response to a bad faith question. Interesting that you see it that way. Delivered calmly and without further elaboration, often disarms a provocative question far more effectively than a detailed rebuttal ever could, because it declines to participate in the framing the question was attempting to establish. This does not mean every difficult or uncomfortable question deserves to be dismissed without engagement. Genuine, difficult questions, asked honestly, deserve honest attention and a real answer. The skill being described is narrower and more specific, learning to distinguish a question seeking real understanding from a question seeking a reaction, and reserving the discipline of the unanswered question specifically for the second category, rather than applying it indiscriminately to every uncomfortable question that happens to arrive. A simple test helps separate the two categories in the moment. A genuine question can usually be answered honestly, without triggering a defensive feeling in the chest or throat. A bad faith question tends to produce exactly that physical tightness, a felt sense of being cornered rather than genuinely asked. Trusting that physical signal rather than overriding it out of politeness is often the fastest way to correctly identify which category a given question actually belongs to. It also helps to remember that declining to answer a bad faith question fully is not the same as being evasive or dishonest. Evasion implies something true is being hidden. Declining a trap disguised as a question is simply refusing to accept a framing that was never actually accurate or fair to begin with. The two can look similar from the outside for a brief moment, but they come from entirely different places, one from concealment and the other from a clear, accurate read of what the question was actually designed to accomplish. There is a specific social risk worth acknowledging honestly, that declining to fully answer a bad faith question can occasionally be misread by onlookers as avoidance or weakness, particularly if the audience has not caught the manipulative framing embedded in the original question. This risk is real, and it is usually smaller than it feels in the moment, because a calm, brief non-answer tends to read as composure to a neutral observer, while a long defensive rebuttal tends to read as exactly the rattled reaction the original question was hoping to provoke. There is a related version of this pause worth applying specifically to written communication. An email, a message, a comment left on a shared document. The instinct to respond immediately, especially to something mildly frustrating, is often just as strong in writing as it is in live conversation, and the ability to simply close the message for a short while before answering carries the exact same benefit as the spoken pause described earlier, converting a reactive reply into a considered one, with the added advantage that written words, once sent, are considerably harder to soften or retract than spoken ones ever were. Chapter 7. Silence as a response to provocation. Provocation is designed to produce a reaction, and the specific reaction it is usually designed to produce is words, a defense, a counterattack, an explanation that can then be used against the very person offering it. Silence, deployed deliberately in response to provocation, removes the exact fuel provocation depends on to escalate any further. Consider a heated accusation delivered in the middle of an argument, one clearly designed to wound rather than to communicate genuine information. The instinctive response is immediate defense, explaining, correcting, countering point for point. This instinctive response, however understandable, usually accomplishes exactly what the provocation was seeking, prolonging the exchange and handing over new material that can be twisted, misquoted, or used to escalate the conflict even further than it had already gone. A brief, steady silence followed eventually by a short, calm response rather than an immediate, detailed one, frequently disarms an accusation far more effectively than an instant rebuttal could. Silence in this context does not signal agreement with the accusation, and it does not signal weakness. It signals that the provocation did not land the way it was intended to, that the response is being chosen deliberately rather than extracted automatically by whatever was just said. This discipline is genuinely difficult to practice, because provocation is specifically engineered to feel unbearable to leave unanswered, tapping directly into old instincts around fairness, reputation, and the fear of being misunderstood if a response does not arrive immediately. Building the tolerance to let a provocative moment pass without an instant defense is less about suppressing the urge to respond and more about trusting that a delayed, deliberate response will almost always land with more actual weight than whatever the first, unfiltered reaction would have produced in the heat of that exact moment. It helps to remember that silence in the face of provocation is not the same as silence in the face of genuine harm requiring a clear, immediate response. This chapter describes emotional provocation designed to produce a reaction for its own sake, not situations requiring firm, immediate boundaries around actual mistreatment. The discipline lies in telling these two situations apart accurately, applying patient silence to provocation, seeking a reaction, and applying clear, direct language to genuine harm requiring an actual response. There is a specific benefit to this discipline that extends beyond any single conversation. Watching someone else's provocation fail to produce the reaction it was seeking tends to reduce how often that provocation gets attempted again in the future. Provocation, over time, tends to concentrate around whoever reliably supplies the reaction it is looking for. A person who consistently declines to supply that reaction becomes, gradually, a much less appealing target for this specific kind of behavior in the first place. There is a physical dimension worth noting here as well. The body often tenses visibly the instant a provocative comment lands, shoulders rising, jaw tightening, before a single word has even been spoken in response. That visible tension frequently signals to the other person that the provocation has already succeeded, regardless of what gets said next. Noticing that tension as it happens, without needing to force it away, is often enough to soften it naturally, which tends to buy exactly the extra moment needed for a calmer, more deliberate response to take shape, instead of a purely reactive one. Chapter 8. Living without needing to be understood by everyone. A significant portion of unnecessary explanation comes from a specific, deeply human fear, being misunderstood, and worse, staying misunderstood, by someone whose opinion matters. This fear drives an enormous amount of otherwise unnecessary talking, restating a point 3 different ways, offering additional context nobody requested, simply because the discomfort of being misread feels intolerable in that particular moment. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century philosopher, wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Applied here, much of the compulsive need to be understood by absolutely everyone stems from a similar discomfort, an inability to simply sit inside someone else's incomplete or inaccurate impression without immediately rushing to correct it. Not every misunderstanding requires correction, and this is one of the harder truths within the power of silence to genuinely accept. Some people will misread intentions no matter how carefully something is explained, and the amount of additional explanation offered to correct that specific misreading is often completely unrelated to how likely that correction actually is to succeed. At a certain point, continuing to explain becomes less about achieving clarity and more about managing an internal discomfort that no amount of external words was ever actually going to resolve. Releasing the need to be understood by everyone does not mean becoming indifferent to how one is perceived entirely. It means reserving genuine effort at clarity for the relationships and situations where being understood actually matters and where continued explanation appears to be helping, rather than spending that same effort reflexively on every misunderstanding, including the ones that were never actually going to be resolved through more words in the first place. There is a useful distinction worth drawing between being misunderstood and being unknown. Being misunderstood implies a specific, correctable error in how something was communicated. Being unknown to certain people, particularly people encountered briefly or superficially, is simply the natural condition of moving through a world full of people who will only ever see a small fraction of who anyone actually is. Treating every instance of the second condition as though it were the first is what drives most of the exhausting, unnecessary explanation this chapter is addressing. There is a freeing shift available once this distinction becomes clear, releasing the responsibility for managing every stranger's or acquaintance's incomplete impression and reserving that responsibility specifically for the handful of relationships where being genuinely known and understood actually matters. This does not lower the standard of honesty applied everywhere else. It simply redirects the energy spent maintaining a full, accurate impression in every single interaction toward the smaller number of relationships where that effort is actually being reciprocated and genuinely valued. There is a broader freedom available once this idea is genuinely internalized, the freedom to be occasionally misjudged by people whose opinion carries little actual weight in a life, without that misjudgment triggering the same urgent need for correction that a misunderstanding from someone deeply valued would rightly deserve. Not every impression needs managing. Learning which impressions genuinely matter and which can simply be allowed to exist inaccurately without consequence is one of the quieter but more liberating shifts available within the broader discipline of silence. This same idea extends naturally into how criticism from strangers or distant acquaintances gets handled. A critical comment from someone with no real stake in a life and no real knowledge of its context rarely deserves the same weight as feedback from someone whose judgment has actually been earned through genuine investment and understanding. Sorting criticism by the credibility of its source, rather than reacting to its volume or its tone, prevents an enormous amount of unnecessary explanation directed at people whose opinion was never going to be changed by it anyway. Chapter 9. The weight of fewer words. Words spoken rarely carry more weight than words chosen carefully and spoken sparingly. A person who speaks constantly trains everyone around them to filter out much of what is said, simply because there is too much of it to weigh individually. A person who speaks less but chooses those words deliberately trains the exact opposite response, closer attention paid to each thing actually said, precisely because there is less of it competing for that same attention. This effect compounds over time in a way that is easy to underestimate. Early in any relationship or professional context, someone who speaks constantly and someone who speaks selectively might receive roughly similar attention. Over months and years, the pattern shifts considerably. The person who speaks constantly becomes background noise, tuned out by habit rather than by conscious choice. The person who speaks selectively becomes someone whose words are specifically listened for, because experience has taught everyone nearby that when this particular person actually speaks, it usually matters. Building this pattern deliberately does not require becoming silent or withdrawn as a general personality. It requires a habit of pausing briefly before speaking in group settings specifically, and asking whether what is about to be said actually adds something the conversation does not already have, or whether it is being said mainly to fill a silence, to be seen contributing, or out of simple habit. This pause, practiced consistently, naturally reduces the total volume of speech while increasing its overall weight, since what remains tends to be the material that genuinely earned its place in the conversation. There is a specific reward this pattern eventually produces that is worth naming directly. Rooms tend to quiet slightly, almost imperceptibly, when a person known for selective, deliberate speech finally begins to speak. That subtle shift, attention arriving before a single word has even been said, is one of the clearest, most reliable signs that fewer words, chosen deliberately over a long period of time, have accumulated into something considerably heavier than volume alone could ever produce. Building this pattern does not happen overnight, and it is worth being honest about the discomfort involved in the early stages. Speaking less than a habitual instinct suggests can initially feel like disappearing, like losing a familiar form of participation and visibility. This discomfort tends to fade as the new pattern produces its own quiet evidence, moments where a carefully chosen comment lands with noticeably more impact than the previous habit of constant, unfiltered participation ever managed to produce. There is a specific measure worth tracking during this transition, not how much less is being said overall, but how much more closely the remaining words seem to be listened to. This shift in listening quality, rather than a simple reduction in talking, is the actual marker that this pattern is taking hold correctly, rather than simply producing withdrawal without the corresponding increase in weight that selective speech is meant to build over time. There is a specific version of this practice worth applying directly in group settings, deliberately allowing at least one other person to speak before contributing on any given topic, rather than reaching immediately to fill the first available silence with a comment. This small delay accomplishes two things at once. It reduces the total volume of unnecessary speech, and it often reveals that someone else was about to make the exact point that would have otherwise been offered, leaving considerably more room for a genuinely new contribution once it is finally time to speak. There is a related discipline worth naming, resisting the urge to add a small extra comment immediately after a strong point has already landed well. This final unnecessary addition often exists purely to soften the impact of the preceding statement, taking some of the edge off a point that was actually working exactly as intended. Letting a strong point simply stand, without immediately following it with something smaller or softer, is frequently the difference between a comment that gets remembered and one that quietly gets forgotten by the time the conversation moves on. Chapter 10. Silence in love, presence without constant justification. Romantic relationships are frequently where over-explaining runs deepest, because the fear of being misunderstood by someone deeply cared about feels sharper than almost anywhere else. A single moment of tension can trigger an avalanche of clarification, restating feelings, re-explaining intentions, apologizing repeatedly for something already addressed once, all driven by the discomfort of sensing distance and rushing to close it immediately with more words. Paradoxically, this exact instinct often creates the opposite of its intended effect. Constant reassurance seeking, constant re-explanation of feelings that were already clearly stated once, can read as anxiety rather than as care, and can subtly train a partner to expect endless clarification rather than trusting that things said once were actually meant and do not require repeated confirmation. A healthier pattern involves saying something important clearly, once, and then trusting both people involved to hold that statement steady without needing it constantly repeated or defended. "I love you," or "this actually hurt me," stated plainly and without an immediate anxious follow-up explanation, tends to land with more genuine weight than the same sentiment surrounded by several additional sentences of justification and reassurance seeking. This does not mean withholding affection, feelings, or important conversations from a partner. It means trusting that a clearly stated feeling does not require constant repetition to remain true, and that the quiet confidence of saying something once and letting it stand often communicates more genuine security within a relationship than the anxious repetition that so often gets mistaken for depth of feeling instead. There is a specific pattern worth watching for directly in close relationships. The difference between checking in out of genuine care and checking in out of anxiety-seeking reassurance. Genuine care tends to ask open questions and listen to the answer without needing it to match a specific, hoped-for response. Anxious checking in tends to repeat the same underlying question in slightly different forms, searching for a particular reassurance rather than genuinely listening for whatever the honest answer happens to be. Recognizing which pattern is actually operating helps clarify whether more words are likely to help, or whether they are simply repeating a request for comfort that words alone were never going to fully satisfy. There is a specific practice worth naming that supports this shift directly within a relationship. Saying an important feeling once, clearly, and then deliberately, resisting the urge to check in repeatedly about whether it landed correctly. If a follow-up genuinely feels necessary, waiting a full day before revisiting the topic often reveals whether the urge to check in again reflects an actual unresolved issue, or simply the temporary discomfort of having said something honest and then having to sit with it unanswered for a little while. This same restraint applies to apologies within a relationship as well. A genuine apology, offered once clearly, and without an extended justification of the circumstances that led to the mistake, tends to be received far better than the same apology repeated across several conversations, each repetition subtly reopening a wound that had already begun to close. Trusting that one sincere apology was actually heard, rather than repeating it out of lingering guilt, allows both people involved to move forward rather than continuing to revisit an issue that has, in practical terms, already been addressed. Chapter 11. Authority without noise at work. Professional environments consistently reward the appearance of confidence, and many people mistake volume, frequent speaking, constant visible activity for that same confidence. In practice, authority in most workplaces tends to accumulate around people who speak less frequently, but with clearly higher signal, rather than around people who speak the most often, regardless of whether each individual contribution actually adds something new. Meetings offer a clear everyday example. The person who comments on every single point raised, restating what others have already said in slightly different words, is rarely the person whose opinion carries the most weight in that room. The person who says little throughout most of the meeting and then offers one clear, well-considered point near a key moment frequently receives more attention and more lasting credit, precisely because their relative silence throughout the rest of the discussion made that single contribution stand out clearly against it. Zeno of Citium, an ancient Stoic philosopher, is remembered for observing that people were given 2 ears and 1 mouth so that they might listen twice as much as they speak. Applied to professional authority specifically, this ratio is not simply good etiquette. It is a genuine strategic advantage, because someone who listens more than they speak accumulates considerably more accurate information about a situation than someone who is constantly speaking, and that accumulated information tends to make whatever they eventually do say noticeably sharper and more useful than it otherwise would have been. Building this kind of authority does not require withholding contribution out of insecurity or fear. It requires a genuine internal filter, speaking specifically when a comment adds something the discussion does not already have, and remaining comfortable with silence the rest of the time, trusting that this restraint itself is quietly building a reputation considerably more valuable than the reputation built by simply being heard the most often in the room. This restraint also changes how feedback and disagreement land when they eventually do need to be voiced. A person known for measured, infrequent speech who eventually raises a concern tends to be taken seriously immediately, precisely because the rarity of their objections has already established that they do not raise concerns casually. A person known for constant commentary faces a harder task making any single concern stand out from the general, continuous stream of opinions they are already known for offering on everything else. This same dynamic explains why quiet, selective communicators are so often trusted with sensitive or difficult conversations, being asked to deliver difficult news, mediate a disagreement, or represent a group's position to someone above them. This trust is rarely accidental. It accumulates specifically because a track record of measured, considered speech signals that whatever gets said in a high-stakes moment will be chosen carefully rather than blurted out reactively the way constant, unfiltered speech so often tends to be. This kind of trust also tends to produce a specific, practical benefit worth naming, being consulted earlier in a decision process rather than only informed after the fact. Colleagues and leaders alike tend to bring genuinely important conversations to the people whose reaction they can predict will be measured and useful, rather than to the people whose reaction is more likely to be immediate, emotional, or scattered across too many simultaneous concerns to be genuinely helpful in a high-stakes moment. There is a broader career pattern worth naming that grows directly out of this trust, being given increasingly larger and more sensitive responsibilities over time, not because of louder self-promotion, but because a track record of measured, reliable communication has quietly demonstrated that discretion and judgment can both be counted on when it actually matters. This kind of advancement tends to feel slower in the short term than the advancement that comes from constant visibility and self-promotion, and it tends to prove considerably more durable over the course of an entire career, precisely because it rests on demonstrated trust rather than on volume alone. Chapter 12. Becoming someone who commands the room without trying. Everything covered across this audiobook points toward a single, integrated way of moving through conversations and relationships, rather than a set of separate tricks deployed only in specific moments. Reducing unnecessary apology, holding a pause before answering, stating boundaries without justification, choosing silence over defensive explanation, these are not isolated tactics. They are different expressions of the same underlying shift, trusting that presence and consistency, rather than volume, are what actually earn lasting respect. Commanding a room without trying does not mean becoming detached, cold, or unreadable. It means becoming someone whose words, when they do arrive, are trusted precisely because they are not constantly spent on things that never needed saying in the first place. This kind of presence tends to feel remarkably calm from the inside, because so much of the anxious internal negotiation, will this be understood? Will this be accepted? Will this require defending? Has simply been released, replaced by a quieter trust that a clearly stated position does not require constant reinforcement to remain true. This shift also changes how conflict and disagreement feel over time. Disagreements stop requiring exhausting extended defense because a position stated clearly once is trusted to stand on its own, rather than needing to be actively maintained through continuous argument. Provocation loses much of its power because it depends on an instant defensive reaction that is no longer reflexively available to trigger. Hand relationships, both personal and professional, gradually reorganize themselves around a simple, quiet truth that what this particular person says can be trusted precisely because it is not said constantly or defensively or out of a need to be immediately understood by everyone present. There is a final important clarification worth making before this audiobook closes. Commanding a room without trying does not mean withdrawing from genuine connection, humor, warmth, or spontaneous conversation. It means those things, when they do happen because they genuinely add something in that moment, rather than because silence felt too uncomfortable to sit inside a second longer. The goal was never less connection. It was connection built on words that were actually chosen, rather than words that simply rushed in to fill whatever space happened to be available. There is one last practical marker worth watching for, a genuine sign that this shift has taken root rather than simply being understood intellectually. Notice over time whether silence itself starts to feel less uncomfortable, whether a pause in conversation begins to feel like a natural, even comfortable part of it, rather than a gap that urgently needs filling. That shift in how silence itself feels, from something to be escaped to something to be inhabited comfortably, is where everything covered in this audiobook eventually settles, not as a technique performed deliberately, but as simply a calmer, steadier way of being present in any room. Conclusion: the respect that was never for sale. Silence throughout this audiobook was never framed as coldness, withdrawal, or a way of avoiding people. It was framed as a currency, one spent carelessly by habit, and one that, held deliberately instead, tends to purchase far more genuine respect than an unlimited supply of explanation, justification, and reassurance ever could. Every chapter here pointed toward the same underlying idea in a slightly different form. Over-explaining signals insecurity more often than honesty. A brief pause before answering signals composure more reliably than an instant response ever could. A boundary stated plainly without apology holds more actual weight than one defended at length. And a person who speaks less, but chooses those words with real care, tends to be listened to more closely than a person whose words arrive constantly and are, over time, quietly filtered out by habit. None of this requires becoming a different, harsher, or more distant version of yourself. It requires noticing, gradually and honestly, how much unnecessary explanation has been given away over the years, out of habit, out of fear of being misunderstood, or simply because silence, in a specific uncomfortable moment, felt unbearable to sit inside. Reclaiming that unnecessary explanation does not diminish honesty or warmth. It simply directs both toward the moments that genuinely deserve them, rather than spending them reflexively on every uncomfortable silence that happens to arrive. There is a quiet, steady confidence available on the other side of this shift. Not the confidence of someone who has stopped caring what others think, but the confidence of someone who has finally stopped needing to prove, defend, or justify what they already know to be true. That confidence, more than any single phrase or technique in this audiobook, is where real, lasting respect has always quietly lived, waiting for the words spent chasing it to finally stop, so it could be recognized on its own. Think back to where this audiobook began, the strange, familiar feeling of finishing an explanation and sensing the room had somehow grown less convinced, not more. That feeling was never proof of failing to explain well enough. It was an early, unrefined signal that words, past a certain point, had started working against the very outcome they were meant to produce. What was missing was not better arguments or more careful phrasing. What was missing was the willingness to trust a single clear sentence and then stop, allowing the silence afterward to do the work that additional words never actually could. That trust, practiced consistently across enough ordinary conversations, is where this entire audiobook ultimately leads, not to someone who says less because they have less to say, but to someone who has finally learned that the most respected voice in most rooms belongs to whoever has stopped needing to fill every silence in order to feel heard. There is a final honest acknowledgement worth making before this audiobook closes. Some situations, some relationships, and some days will still pull toward the old habit of over-explaining, and that pull does not mean any of this has failed to work. It simply means the old pattern was practiced for far longer than the new one has had time to settle in. Noticing the pull without harsh self-judgment and choosing the shorter, clearer sentence anyway, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, is exactly how this shift actually takes hold over time, one ordinary conversation at a time, rather than through a single permanent decision made once and never revisited again. None of this was ever about winning every conversation or appearing untouchable. It was about noticing how often words were spent on approval that was never actually in question, on defenses nobody demanded, on explanations offered purely to escape a silence that was never actually dangerous to begin with. Letting that silence stay, a little more often than habit initially allows, is where the respect this audiobook set out to describe finally has room to arrive on its own. This has been Coffee and Audiobooks. Until the next chapter, keep your coffee close, keep your words few, and let your silence finally speak for you.